Good morning and welcome to the second plenary session. My name is Joaquin Gonzalez and I'm chairing that session. Where we're here today, Professor Christophe Champod, on a talk entitled Forensic Science and Biometric Systems and Possible Mix. Professor Champod received his Master of Science and PhD in Forensic Science, both from the University of Lausanne in 1990 and 1995 respectively. From 1999 to 2003, he led the Interpretation Research Group of the Forensic Science Service at the United Kingdom. And then he took a professorship position at the School of Criminal Sciences, Institute of Forensic Science at the University of Lausanne. He's in charge of education and research on identification methods, and he's a member of the International Association for Identification and was elected in 2004 as a member of the API-sponsored Scientific Working Group on Friction-Rich Analysis, Study and Technology. His research is devoted to the statistical evaluation of forensic identification techniques, and he has focused his interest in the value of fingerprint evidence. So, Christophe?
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to start with giving my thanks to the organizer for allowing me to be here. And I would like also to start with a small connection to the previous talk. I think at the end of the day, what really warms me up to forensic science is to help justice and manifestation of justice, and to help to give identity. And I think the Indian program is absolutely fantastic. Before I start, I think I cannot resist to sum up a little piece of history. The well-known Galton-Henry system, which at the turn of the 20th century served as a basis for the deployment of fingerprinting as an identification method, received the name of Galton for obvious reason and received the name of Henry. Henry developed the system in India, and it was only in the 70s that some papers were finally published to give credit to the two Indian researchers who developed the system in India, and was of course brought back to England and deployed as the Sir Henry system. We had to wait for 50 years before it was officially made clear that India led the way at the time in all the processes with regard to identifying people. And it is quite impressive to see that India is leading the way today as well with their program, and I was very impressed with the whole presentation. To the point where I thought, well, I'd rather have half an hour and have an hour on this program, but that's the state of affair. Is it an impossible mix? Well, the previous speaker gave excellent argument to suggest that it is not an impossible mix. In fact, it's a future mix. But I started with this quite entertaining question for you to wake up in the morning and come here. I think there is merit in the mix if we are clear about what we do. And I will take the next hour on exposing some of the challenges that our two communities are facing. So I'm more coming from the forensic science community, and in this room at large we have representative of the biometric community, and I will in fact I will try to play the wedding arrangement today and explore some of the difficulties. The first challenge, and it was referred to yesterday, is to have a shared understanding of the concept of operations. Now, I will use examples through my talk, but they have been chosen because of their availability to me. But keep in mind that they can be translated in various different settings. What I noticed is that when a biometric system is offered to a police authority, the exchange is not based on a clear understanding of the use case in which the system will be deployed. The exchange is based on the dream of biometric system applied to an impossible police task. And that leads to a range of difficulties which we start to identify nowadays, especially with the arrival of very efficient new biometric system based on more soft biometric or biometry which have less of a discriminating power. So outside DNA and fingerprints, I'm thinking about face, for example. And this system have been sold, if I may say so, under the impression that they're going to solve it all problems of police forces, facing, for example, a large increase on submission from CCTV images. And I think what is absolutely critical is to identify at the outset, in fact, before deployment. What I know is these things are set up after deployment, but before deployment, what are the use case and what will be the context in which it will be used? And there is two elements I'd like to highlight. The first is that the outcome of using a biometric system in forensic science has multiple visages. It's a multifaceted problem which can lead to either providing intelligence or may lead to providing evidence which will be presented in a court of law. And this distinction between investigative use and evaluative use is absolutely critical for the proper conduct and use of these systems. And there is a lot of blurriness, both on the biometric side and on the forensic side, as to what are we trying to achieve. These two customers, the intelligence as opposed to the court, they have different expectations. They have different approach towards risk, and they have different method to measure performance. A head of police is interested to put the right resources in a timely manner at the right places, and is happy, so to speak, to take some risk in the designation of potential person to follow. The investigative leads, the management of uncertainty on an investigative leads is quite different than the management of uncertainty when you have someone in the dock and the court of law has to make a decision regarding its identity. Then I think I will use here face recognition as a conduit to bring this argument home. We took commercial off-the-shelf system, which we deployed 3 years ago in a police force. At the outset, we just said, we're going to try. It was a pilot experiment. Very quickly, we had to, the element which was the most difficult to do was to manage expectations. Because police and police investigators have very strong expectations towards forensic science. And when you talk about face as a query image, and face in the forensic context, which may look like this gentleman taken during the robbery of 2 banks, the quality of images and the difficulty assigned with it make it quite difficult to find a potential correspondence. A case like this one, if entered on the system, off-the-shelf system allow to bring back the potential correspondent at rank 32. And this is viewed by the police as a success because an operator can just scan through maybe 50 people out of a hit list and very quickly make a one-to-one, so to speak, comparison holistically and decide, yes, that's the person of interest, and you have an investigative lead. And the database which is currently used in that force is 60,000 images from the mugshots taken at the arrest of people. And that seems like a dream scenario, but this is what I call the global search. And at times it will pay, so to speak. And when I say this, it's in police terms. In other cases, it's much more difficult. And what we notice is, due to the quality of the input image, the chance of getting the right person in decent position in the rank list needs to be. Technology is not the only driver, and we may use contextual information to adjust the search parameters in order to improve on efficiency. In order to have this candidate to be listed number 5, we had to search in a section of a database which deal with people which have been either arrested for, convicted, or suspected of that type of fraud, which is a fraud towards the ATM machines. If you search the entire database, there is no chance you will find him. So bringing in information regarding the context, and that was mentioned yesterday, is key in order to improve on efficiency in operational usage. But then begs the question about, oh, hold on a second, forensic science and context, they don't go well together, because very quickly you might be accused of being biased towards a certain type of population. And that's when this argument pops up, it translates a drastic misconception between intelligence and evaluation. And the last one is comparing ID documents to photographs taken in the line of duty. And that candidate is positioned on position 3. And the next question, and I'm trying all the time to mix between investigative issues, which were the one before, and I move now to evaluative issues, is, well, for a judge, how can I convey the weight I'd like to assign to this? On one hand, there is a biometric system which brought back that individual in position 3 on a gallery of 60,000. And in addition, and you probably have done it yourself, I have blurred the eyes a little bit, but you probably have done yourself the holistic task of comparing the features on the ID document face and the face of the individual I display. And you probably have made your mind somehow as to whether or not we are talking about the same person. And now I'm not talking about intelligence. I'm not talking about going to that address and ask a few questions through traditional police practice. I'm talking about you have that person in court. And that's probably one of the key elements in the case a judge will have to make a decision on. What is the weight of evidence you will assign to this? Well, we know that to get a proper weighing of the forensic findings, we need to inquire about 2 probability densities, and they were referred to yesterday. In a nutshell, we need to have information about the within source variability and the between sources variability, and it is the ratio between these 2 probability densities which guide towards the weight of evidence to be assigned to this comparison, which I have here referred to as E. Let's see if I can play with that a bit. I will not be able. Sorry. It's so the score out of the system is reflected here, which provides some support for the view that we are talking about the same person. Now, one of the difficulty in practice is that the within sample variability is unknown, because these 2 images are the only ones available in the case. We don't have any form of previous photographs or gallery which may help to inform the within source variability. It's intractable, to the point that it might be simply just impossible to assess the weight of evidence to be assigned to this score out of of the face recognition system. So what do we do? Well, so does it all come down to an expert judgment? And there is some documentation, and here I'm just referring to one group promulgating some standard process to make facial recognition for an expert in a holistic way, through different processes, some of them going through landmarks positioning and superimposition. I think the question remains, if you don't have data for the within variability, so you don't have data to inform the density we'd like to see to assign a likelihood ratio, if that sort of data is unavailable to assign a likelihood ratio using a biometric system, well, that sort of data is also unavailable to an expert applying a holistic mechanism. So I have some doubts. I will come back later in my presentation. I have some reservation to the view that if it is too difficult to do using a biometric system, an expert can handle it using a different mechanism. I think there is merit at exploring the limits of expertise and recognize that if something is untractable using technology, it might shed some light on the hope that it is tractable using a holistic approach. So the first, I just close here my first challenge, which is understanding what we do on both sides of the fence. And I don't think we do really well understand what we do overall. The second challenge is to have a clear definition of a respective role of technology and forensic experts. And I will use the lights out identification as a conduit in that presentation for that argument. Lights out identification is used quite at a large scale now for transaction between 10 fingers and 10 fingers, or 2 fingers to 10 fingers in some countries. I'd like to expand the use to latent to print comparisons. And I will introduce to you some latent marks collected from typical crime scenes, and they do vary a lot in terms of quality, difficulty associated with the background, positioning, etc. What we wanted to explore is what are today's possibilities offered by using an AFIS system in a complete lights-out mode with auto-encoding of these latent, automatic search and return of the hit list to see what the future might be. It leads us to rethink the concept of operations of an AFIS system in a police force. It already have happened in some police forces when it comes to 10 print to 10 print. Now, if you go to a police force and say bluntly, you know what, you can make identification without looking at the images. For an expert, it's like if you are the Antichrist. I have been the Antichrist on a lot of subjects for fingerprint people for the last 20 years, so that's a position which I'm accustomed to. Let's take these images and search them through an AFIS. What we observed on a database of roughly 1,800 marks is that the corresponding candidate, when you mix him with a database of 1 million, comes back in position 1 in roughly 70% of the cases. And the system is designed, the score computation is designed so that the rest of the ranks are not distributed equally on all of them. As you can see, if the candidate is not position 1, he will be down in the hit list in position 500 or more. Now, what does it mean? It means that, technically speaking, in a very operational way, even if you keep an expert to look at this comparison, you can do 70% of identification in position 1 if you just check position 1. And when I'm using the term checking, I mean verifying in the fingerprint business. It means that there is no need, traditionally a police force will encode a mark, search it, have another expert to look at it and make a decision. And that will take some time. So here you can get rid of one component by going straight into automatic search and just ask the verification stage to be carried out at the end. Well, it allowed to concentrate more efforts on the 30% of the cases which are not coming back in position 1. And you can gain some efficiency and also gain the possibility to increase the number of submissions. Now, all this, for you biometricians, it's just a statement of the obvious, that these new ways of working can be developed and deployed. In a very traditional forensic police environment, something which may seem obvious to you is completely alien to the service, unless there is a communication conduit which is in place and allowed to develop these new ways of working in a win-win situation. Let's take another step in trying to define the role here. What I just suggested was to get rid of the first search manual and just go straight automatic, but keep the verification stage. So now the further step is why doing a verification stage? Why not just simply giving back an intelligence lead based on the lights out search? So the sort of scenario I have in mind here is having a police officer on the crime scene, taking a photograph of a latent finger mark, submitting it directly to the AFIS system in a blind, so auto-encoded search. The system take a decision at the end and send you back the potential name of the person who left the mark without anyone in that process apart from him having had a look at the mark. So here is the crux of the matter. What I'm doing here is I'm just applying the traditional biometric concept of decision making out of a system, which for you is bread and butter. To a forensic scientist, this is bizarre because biometric system in forensic science has always been used only as sorting devices, but we never allowed them, so to speak, to make decisions. And here we are talking about making decisions out of a system without an expert. And I use the term expert on purpose, someone who knows more than the system, of course, to take the decision. Well, let's explore what it would mean. So here I'm playing on two elements. The one is it's all about understanding what we do, and there is this evaluative and investigative exercise. Here I'm shifting the concept into intelligence. And these systems, which give you rank 1, roughly in 70% of the cases, they come with additional measure which may help us to make further decision. One, I had the chance to have the algorithm from Anil on latent quality measure, which we apply to all these marks. And also the system itself gives you back some data which may help you to decide whether a person in rank 1 is truly the right person or not. When I say truly, it's obviously in a probabilistic sense. If you train a decision system based on this ground truth data to make appropriate decisions using these variables, and we have used random forest to do this, the key variables sorted out by importance are the score, the difference of score between the score at rank 1 and the score at rank 2, and the quality measure to some degree. The error rate is roughly 10%. Now I'm bringing back this into a discussion with the head of police as to whether or not we will put this into operations. And it's all about balancing the risks. I think that police environments, they are not very good at dealing with percentages. I mean, they deal with numbered problems, not percentage problems. Let's assume that there is roughly 340 marks submitted to the police force every week, and we'd like to use lights out. The first question is to assess what would be an acceptable error rate. And let's assume this is the performance of the system, and let's assume that we make a decision, the police make a decision, that 2% is an acceptable error rate to work towards. What does it mean operationally speaking when you apply that threshold? It means that in our day-to-day practice, we'll have roughly 130 identification correct for free. So it will be the right name delivered back in a timely manner to the investigator. But there is 3 cases per week where it will be misleading information. If we confuse the use of fingerprints as evidence with the use of fingerprints as intelligence, as suggested here, you jump on the seat and say, oh, we have 3 persons in jail for nothing. We have 3 innocents behind the bars, which is not what I suggest. What we are just suggesting here is providing an investigative lead, which is nothing but an investigative lead, which will need to be incorporated in normal police practice. So we are not talking about evidence. We are talking about information. Unless the authority has a clear understanding between the difference between the two, if this is not in place, there is no chance to develop, to embark on that sort of discussion. So this second challenge is to have a clear understanding of what we do and who will do what and what it will provide. The first challenge is closer to the issues associated with the weight of evidence. And I use the term evaluative opinion to reflect the stage at which an expert is standing up in court and providing a statement in a court of law. So this is not intelligence, it's a different game. And recently, and I take fingerprint as an example, we observed some changes. Well, one of them is that identification using fingerprints is not portrayed anymore as a factual outcome. There is consideration to some degree that errors may occur. In fact, the Mayfield case, who started as a mark from the Madrid bombing, is not alien to this. It had consequences to wake up the community and say, look, you cannot continue to portray your evidence in court as a factual certainty. And Swickfast came up with this lovely sentence, well, I'm a bit responsible for it, where we try to make explicit that it is all a matter of probabilities. They might be considered to be small enough to be considered as practical impossibility, but that does not mean they don't exist. The adverse chance of having a random or an adventitious coincidence is a reality which needs to be accounted. And what the expert is doing is making a decision. Now, in your environment, what a decision is associated with a biometric system is very clearly defined. In forensic science, what is a decision is not clearly defined. But there is an obvious move from a situation where it was presented as a fact to a situation where fingerprint evidence is presented as an opinion. And this is coming from a very important inquiry in Scotland following a misattribution of a mark to a police officer and another individual. And the judge in that judicial inquiry, in his report, which is quite lengthy and available on the internet, suggested very clearly that this is not fact, this is a matter of opinion. Now, to the question, is that just my opinion versus your opinion? He went a little bit further and said that, well, it's not only make sure that you choose the right terms, but it is down to the transparency. So the weight or trust you will bring to the opinion is to be measured against the level of transparency the experts had. What is a transparent decision process for fingerprint identification? Well, this is my little exposure of what are the sort of decision steps taken in fingerprint identification. Most fingerprint experts will believe, and I say believe because I don't think it is the case, that they start with a prior on each case which is commensurable to the inverse size of the Earth population. When someone is identified in court based on a latent print, the expert witness will tend to suggest that this is that person to the exclusion of all others. To the exclusion of all others where? Not just all others in Madrid, not all others in Spain, but all others on the face of the earth. So there is a starting point by default taken by expert, which is in relation to that person in the dock in reference to the earth population. And then comes the fingerprint evidence, which some strength, which I'm showing with this arrow. And the arrow has the effect, when it is moving towards the identification, to reduce, so to speak, the size of the initial population to something which is smaller. Smaller to the point where the expert is happy to make a decision. In Bayesian terms, we are talking about moving from a prior, which is inverse to the all fingers on Earth, and thanks to the weight of evidence provided by the fingerprint evidence, which can be translated in the form of a likelihood ratio, the posterior is considered to be high enough in favor of that further proposition of a prosecution that the expert will decide that it is an identification. And what is coming into play here are the sort of utility functions. So these utility functions they were implicit in the previous discussion. They are still implicit in the current way or state of affair. Now, one, I think, critical component of this chart is to realize that what is going on implicitly in forming an opinion is taking on the shoulders of the expert more than just the contribution of the evidence. There is more than the likelihood ratio considered in the decision-making process. There is an implicit recognition or use of priors, allegedly to the face of the earth, and there is an implicit application of a utility function which translate core values of the expert, how adverse he is to make wrong decisions and how beneficial right decisions are. And that utility function is the driver for him to make decisions and to reach that opinion. If we realize this, then the picture becomes a little bit clearer. This is what I mean by transparent decision-making process. It is far from being what is going on in practice today. People will have difficulty to articulate what they do in a Bayesian decision process. Now, if we want to bring in biometric system in that sort of game, there is a need for the whole community to agree on the basic decision processes that are in place, both on the biometric side and the forensic scientist side. We can certainly see a shift from a situation where the only metric against which the expert were measures were in terms of years of experience. The first question I was asked when I started research in fingerprint area in some 20 years ago was, how many cases have you done? How many years of experience have you been working in fingerprint? So I was replying, well, I've done 2 or 3 cases and 6 months in the job. And then you had this lovely smile on the face of the person I was talking to, because it was obvious that I was a rookie who had nothing to say of relevance until he has 20 years of experience in the job. And there is merit in experience, don't get me wrong, but there is also merit in going beyond experience. Experience is quite often used as a small flag to say, believe me, trust me. Trust me as an expert. Nowadays it's quite easy for me, oh, you know what, I've been doing this for 20 years, and this is true in fact. Jeez. So you have to believe me what I say is by definition more trustworthy than my first talk I gave 20 years ago. I don't think so. So we are moving from a stage where everything was the metric for performance, were down to the number of cases you had done. Number of cases which were, you had no idea about the ground truth, by the way. I've done that case, I have no clue whether it was right or wrong. Well, it should be right because he had been convicted. Thank you. So we are moving to a stage where we try to give more structured and transparency again. Now that's where the biometric systems comes in. There is a body of research which attempts to use output of biometric system in a systematic manner to provide a measurement of the weight of the evidence. And I will use fingerprint as an example. So a recent paper that has been published last year in the Royal Statistical Society shows a system whereby, based on the number of minutiae found in correspondence between a mark and a print, you can predict quite reliably the likelihood ratio associated with this comparison, with a proviso that there is no adverse observations. And the likelihood ratio are substantial, and they provide strong evidence in favor of common sources when the number of minutiae increase. Now, I'd like to explore with you in the last 10 minutes how can we live together? Me, a holistic expert with 20 years of experience who make decision in court, and a system who may guide me or otherwise as to the strength of the evidence, and how these two entities, which in fact are two experts, can operate together. Well, one of the questions which lies behind the use of this system is having some reflection on the error rates. And I'm using here what is called in the discipline a Tippett plot. By the way, Tippett was not a fingerprint examiner, but a paint examiner. But apart from this, we gave him the name of the plot to reflect the sort of weight of evidence you expect under two proposition. On one side, in red, the likelihood ratio obtained when you compare entities of different sources, and the other curve reflect the cumulative likelihood ratio obtained when you compare mark and print of the same source. And because every system has some error, there is two forensic error rates which are quite different from the error rates which have been presented yesterday at length, because there is no decision here. It's just about the likelihood ratio. So we cannot really measure the efficiency of a forensic system by measuring how much right or wrong decision it took, because when it comes to likelihood ratio, there is no decision, it's just the weight of evidence. However, in some cases, and it is what we try to avoid, the system will point you in the wrong direction by degree. So there is two error rates here, which are rates of misleading evidence in favor of respectively the prosecution and defense proposition, the prosecution view being the same source and the defense proposition being different sources. And this is a question which is quite difficult. Well, is it good enough? 3% error rate. Is it good enough for forensic deployment? Would a judge allow this in court? What is the acceptable error rate in an area which for 100 years believed that the error rate was 0? And no, it's not. There is a risk to mislead. What it would be. So first, there is the need to ask these questions. There is the need to handle probabilities and error rates, but not only in the technical sense of measuring them, which is a given, but in the operational sense. And unless we engage in that discussion about what is an acceptable error rate and how you handle it, both in the biometric community and in the forensic community, will be stuck. Now, the other usage of model is to say, well, that's nice and neat. Give me your likelihood ratio calculator and it will back up my opinion. So part of the transparent argument. And that was mentioned by Lord Campbell in his report as well. But this is not that easy. If you're an holistic expert and you have been doing this for 20 years, like me, and the system provides you a likelihood ratio going towards exclusion, but you are convinced it was an identification, what do you do? Well, my first reaction is to say, well, system is crap. That's the only, no? So who takes the lead? Someone? Which of these experts should lead the way? So let's explore this. Because I think in the future, the type of situation we want to avoid is this one. Facing this comparison, and you have a mark and a print, with some minutiae, annotated in correspondence between the two, you have an expert saying, I have identified that person, it's the right thumb of Mr. X, and following SWIG-FAST guidelines, I think that the chance of someone else leaving the same, or proposing the same mark is so remote that I consider this as a practical impossibility. And on the other hand, the defense in an adversarial system will say, well, we submitted that case to a professor in statistics from a given university, and he applied a statistical model to that case and came back with a likelihood ratio roughly of 1 billion, which amounts to a match probability which is 10 to minus 7. How do you get an identification from that sort of number? We know it is down to how the decision process is made. It's down to the decision theory which the expert is using to come up with this. Certainly to say that this 10 to minus 7 is a practical impossibility will be a bit foolish. It does not mean that the expert is wrong, but it means that in order to handle that situation, they will need to discuss together. And by discuss together, I'm talking about mutual understanding. So there is a need before implementing biometric system to help in weighing evidence. In an area, and that's the huge difference with DNA, in an area which have been practiced by holistic procedures for years, there is a need to have standard operating procedures in place to handle the situation. And I don't think examiners are completely adverse to this, but they raise in their feedback very interesting points. First, they all agree that the path, the way towards bringing statistics and numbers in court is inevitable. But they need to understand it, they need to trust the model, explain its limits and meaning, and they will be asked for these numbers from both prosecution and defense. But they may want still to identify, even though the numbers are not backing them up. So what we are, I think, trying to define here is a conflict resolution procedure between experts, an expert supplemented by a statistical model which are derived from the sort of technology you play with. I'd like to take you through a little bit an alarming example. I feel the steam is going down, so I need to bring you some data which will scare you a bit. We had the chance with some colleagues to undertake a large proficiency study across fingerprint examiners in the US, submitting them 15 cases to look at using their traditional holistic approach. And we looked at the results obtained on these 15 comparisons. These 15 comparisons have been chosen to be difficult, so everything was made to operate at the decision boundaries of the process. And I'd like to concentrate on one trial, which is trial number 12. That case has been submitted to 140 examiners. the conclusions, the grand truth associated with that comparison is that the print is not from the same source as the mark. The grand truth is that it is from a different source. Now, here is the results from that we obtained from practitioners. 11 people wrongly identified the mark. So in a discipline which believed for a century that it was error-free, it can be quite shocking to see this. Now, it may shock you as well when the next time you see CSI on TV and the sort of certainty associated with CSI. Now, 73 correctly excluded that donor, and 40 people said, well, I remain inconclusive. If you tease out the inconclusive and ask them to whether they guide towards identification or not, and that's the next graph. So this is our 11 wrong identification. This is all together the inconclusive, but these are all the people who said, you know what, I'm not prepared to say it's an identification, but I'm prepared to say that it is guiding towards identification. So there is when you put people at the boundaries of the decision-making system, well, it's not a surprise to see that there is variations. And there is a lot of people which guide towards identification in that case. Now, does a likelihood ratio system help? Well, let's do a few cases. So this is the annotations provided by one examiner, not certified, 3 years of experience. I'm doing this on purpose, you will see why. And when you run the minutiae through the likelihood ratio system, the likelihood ratio is very small and it provides very strong evidence in favor of a view that it is not the right person. The annotations provided by the examiners are out of phase and drive towards the exclusion. You say, okay, that's good. I can see here a mechanism, quality control mechanism to handle these cases. Second examiner, certified examiner, 5 years of experience. Here is the annotations. And the likelihood ratio as well is guiding towards the exclusion. The next one, a certified examiner with 7 years of experience. Much more minutiae. For those of you who count in the little points, there is a huge variation in what people will annotate to support their conclusions. The likelihood ratio here is quite high. It's providing very strong support for the view that it is coming from the same source. There is good reason why it is high. In fact, in the annotation system, the examiner made everything possible to make it fit. So, again, something which is not a surprise to you, if you put something in which is different from one examiner to the other, you will have a different output. And that brings back to the question, how do we combine these things together? How do we handle them? And for me, that's one of the key questions for the future. Now, let's make an outlook on this. At the moment, we have an holistic expert in these disciplines. And I will use fingerprints, but I hope to convince you that will be exactly the same whether we are talking about a handwriting expert, face recognition expert, and the like. So there is a practice of making judgment and forming opinion by looking at these images. And there is a range of features which are used by these experts, and here I have teased out some of the features used in fingerprint identification, which traditionally we call level 1, level 2, and level 3. Here comes the newcomer. That's a likelihood ratio-based biometric system. To help, the first decision to make is to identify which features are used by one and which features remain in the area of expertise that is left to the expert. Of course, if the likelihood ratio system covers all features which are used by a system, by the expert in the holistic form, I would be quite happy to claim that I will trust the likelihood ratio system more than the expert. Why? Is because the likelihood ratio are assigned based on a systematic study of both the within and the between source variability. There is a lot of proviso behind this, caveat in terms of how much work we have invested into this, but as long as we are talking about decent-sized experiment we published in peer-reviewed journals, I would have no problem whatsoever to use this as a fair representation of the weight of evidence. So in this sort of handling between biometric and holistic, if the biometric system is all-encompassing in terms of features, I will trust the biometric system more than I would trust an expert. In fact, in all of these disciplines, if you do proficiency tests, and you have seen the results before, the error rate is quite often much higher than the error rate a biometric system will provide. So yes, it will take over. This is not very politically correct in forensic circles to say. Now, to come back to a more realistic situation, we all recognize that we are not covering in the modeling all features used by an expert. And there is other features, currently level 3 features, for example, which are not used at all by current biometric technology, and certainly not in a form which can lead to likelihood ratios. So here is the catch. I think in order to make a compelling argument for me to say that I will not trust the likelihood ratio out of a biometric system and I will rely on these additional features and consideration to convince myself of my rightful conclusion of identification, I need to be able to have an argumentative discourse. But hold on a second, the argumentative discourse cannot be, I have done this for 20 years. This is not an argumentative discourse. The argumentative discourse needs to be focused on both the numerator and the denominator of a likelihood ratio. So there is a requirement to convey through a structured argument how do you assign in a very Bayesian way a likelihood ratio to these features. And if this is absent from the discourse of the expert, I would not even consider it. At best, in the worst case scenario, the error rate should be presented. The error rate obtained in task-relevant proficiency tests. So I'm not talking, for those of you who know a bit about fingerprints, I'm not talking about CTS tests for fingerprint identification, which even my grandmother will do it on Saturday morning without making a mistake. I'm talking about tests which are close to the complexity of the mark we are talking in this case. If that argumentative line is not available, I think there is no expertise. If there is no expertise, we have to rely on the biometric system alone, regardless of the belief in these other features. I'd like to come to a conclusion and just switch this one, which will be for the discussion. I think I'm trying to do a wedding between biometrics and forensic science. So one may come from Mars and the other from Venus. Which one? Well, yesterday night I decided that biometric is from Mars and forensic science is from Venus. Well, the first task, I believe, to a successful mix is to have friendly visit in each other respective clubs or planets. And I enjoyed very much being here for the last day and the next few days with you. But please do the reverse. Pay a visit at times in a forensic science conference. That's the requirement to meet for a start. And then I have some suggestion from a prenup agreement. My first suggestion is to define jointly use cases that address the needs of a forensic investigation. Without clearly defined use case, we will hit communication issues. Then we need to jointly agree on territories of excellence. The lights out versus manual operation is an example. With my wife, we have other type of territories. It is critical. And again, there is the perception that you are infringing the territories of each other, then we are running the difficulties of a difficult wedding. And finally, if we don't want to have a divorce, we need to jointly identify the mutual benefit in relation to the production or birth of evaluative reports. And if these three are, I believe that if these three agreements are mutually understood and shared at the outset, that paved the way for a very successful mix between forensic science and biometric science. Otherwise, we will face the difficulties that at times, and I'm not saying every time, but at times this community may face about having a poor understanding of their respective contribution and how they can contribute to the whole process. As the previous speaker said, I think biometric science has a lot to offer, both to law enforcement and to society at large. And I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Christophe. Your talk was perfectly on time. It's a good Swiss clock. We have about 5 minutes for some questions from the audience.
What is the biggest challenge that you are facing by, introducing those biometrics idea into the forensic field? You mentioned some, but I guess there are some maybe anecdotal ones that you did not formally mention here that you still would like to share with us.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is building up bridges between the communities, especially in areas close to police practice. Fingerprint being a good example. Fingerprint evidence is so efficient that very quickly in the historical development, police forces decided that you don't need scientists to do this. You can hire a police officer, and after 1 or 2 weeks of training, he will be proficient to do this, and through practice and years of experience, he will develop himself or herself. So you will face a community which, by tradition, are not at all coming from the scientific environment, haven't been brought up as scientists, but are coming from the ranks of the police directly, and without me making any value judgment, but that's a reality of the population you are facing. Hence, when a group like this, of most of you are PhDs or above, in very technical fields, try to interact, the terminology is just not in place. And as perhaps you have been surprised by the sort of terminology I have been using, which were far away from your terminology. So it takes time, and give time the merit that we have to give it. It takes time for this mutual understanding and trust to build up. And the club visit I suggested, do it on a regular basis, have maybe a sandwich lunch on a monthly basis with your local police force to discuss other things than technology and techniques, but to have this sort of mutual understanding that develop, and that's the most challenging thing to do.
Thank you.
So I was very surprised by the 3 annotations which you showed for the latent print by different experts. So based on that, my question is, do you think we need to go and give an uncertainty value for each other minutiae being marked by the expert? You talked about uncertainty at the whole decision level.
Yeah.
Now we need to look at the uncertainty at the feature level itself.
Yes. I hadn't the chance to go in a lot of detail regarding these outcomes, but if you give the same images from the same source or different sources to the same experts, they will vary enormously in their annotations, and they will vary enormously in the confidence they will assign to minutiae. To answer quickly, I think yes, we need to account for this, absolutely. Now, how to account for this when there is so many variations to the user? there is two options. One is to get rid of a user, which has some prospect. I really believe that technology may come to a point where the minutiae detection, which will be robust and free from external influences, or is to develop mechanism where it is not whether I see it and you see it, but it is some sort of a collective consensus development of practice, where this is served independently to 2 or 3 people, and they come up with their joint minutiae, trusted by some sort of a vote mechanism between the experts.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. So for the practical example you showed in fingerprint, did you use a commercial matcher in use in forensic laboratories? And do you think these errors are representative of the state-of-the-art technology in AV systems?
So you're thinking about the lines out?
Yeah.
The lines out was based on a commercial one.
A commercial one?
Yes.
And these errors in rank 1, rank 2, 70%, 30%?
That's just the results out of that experiment. So what we did, we bought a full operational AFIS system, and we fed the system with our own data. And the latent that has been used, or the marks that has been used, that's marks which we had collected through the line of activities of our laboratory.
Thank you.
I think the boundaries between what has been actually done and maybe misunderstood is not very clear. I mean, did you, in those 70% report, did you pick these minutiae in the finger marks manually, or was it completely done by the...
Completely done automatically.
Yeah. So I would like to ask then, what would be if that was replaced by the minutiae extracted by the experts? What figure would be most likely?
There is an increase in performance. So if you take all the marks which were not in position 1 and you re-encode them, you will have some of them coming back in position 1, to a cost, of course, of a user interaction. But yes, I mean, you may believe, and some may believe, that the expert encoding outperform auto-encoding in a huge way. Now, the recent results we obtained with the latest generation AFIS system show that it is not the case. So we will recover some of the cases through a manual encoding, but the type of performance auto-encoding is getting us nowadays seems to show that there is marks which will not, experts will not help the system a lot.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. You have invited the people from the biometric clubs to visit the people from the other side, the forensics and the security. But the main problem is those guys in the forensics, police forensics, they don't release the database, the rich database that we actually interested in very easily. There are very strict rules and such things. Don't you think this make the wedding that you are saying more difficult?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Availability of data is a critical concern. For example, we had the luxury of having a privileged relationship with the police, but the data they make available to us are made available only to us. And there is no way I can share these images to other groups of research. And this is a problem. And I think there is a very nice prospect at thinking about building up cooperative databases which can be shared in the privileged community based on forensic cases. And you're absolutely right. It's a critical difficulty.
Okay, so thank you, Christophe.
You're welcome.